My stepson charged people money to party in my house. Not had people over, charged them. He had a Venmo link and an entry fee and a capacity count and a playlist, and what I later learned was an arrangement with 3 different people to manage the door, the bar area which was my kitchen, and what he described in the event listing as the main floor which was my living room. My living room. The listing, which I found because a neighbor texted me a screenshot at 8:47 p.m., described the event as an exclusive private venue experience in a premium North Raleigh location. The entry fee was $20. He had 64 RSVPs. That was $1,280. In my living room. On a Saturday night when I was 2 hours away in Charlotte at a professional conference that I had told him about 3 weeks in advance, and that he had apparently decided was a window of opportunity rather than an absence he was expected to manage. He was 20 years old. He had been living with me and his mother for 2 years. He had a room, a refrigerator stocked with food I purchased, a parking spot in the driveway, and what I had believed was a basic understanding that the house was a home and not a venue. I was wrong about the last one. I found this out from the neighbor's text at 8:47. I did not drive back to Raleigh. I did not call the police. I did not call his mother, who was at a separate event that evening. I sat in my hotel room in Charlotte and I opened my laptop. I logged into my home network router. The router was mine. The network was mine. The name on the account was mine. The password was in a notes app on my phone because I had set the whole system up myself in 2019 and had been the only person in the house who understood how it worked. This was, as it turned out, a significant advantage. I looked at the connected devices. There were 41 of them. At 9:11 p.m., I turned off the Wi-Fi. Not rebooted, off, every device in the house dropped from the network simultaneously. 41 phones. A DJ setup that was running a streaming playlist. The speakers throughout the house, which I had installed myself over a weekend in 2020, and which were connected to my network and which were therefore, as of 9:11 p.m., back under my control. At 9:13 p.m., I opened the speaker management app. I selected all zones. I set the volume to 72%. I went to my music library. I selected Beethoven's Symphony No. 5 in C minor. I pressed play. My stepson Connor texted me at 9:14. He said, "Dad, the speakers." I replied, "What about them?" He said, "Please stop." I replied, "Stop what?" He said, "You know what." I replied, "Enjoy the party." He sent 3 more messages that I read, but did not reply to. His mother texted me at 9:22 after Connor reached her. She said, "Paul, what are you doing?" I said, "Enjoying some music." She said, "Connor says everyone is leaving." I said, "I hope they got their money's worth." She said, "We need to talk about this." I said, "We do. I have thoughts on the venue business as well." The party was over by 9:45. What happened the following morning when I drove back to Raleigh was the real conversation. Before I tell you what Connor said and what I said back and what we decided together that Sunday morning, I want to take you back to where this story actually started. Because Connor was not a bad kid. He was a kid who had been given the wrong lesson about what belonging to a household actually meant. And giving him the right lesson required something more targeted than a lecture. It required Beethoven at 72%. Like this video right now, subscribe to this channel and ring the notification bell. Comment below, when I said I turned off the Wi-Fi and opened the speaker app, what did you think was coming? Let us start from the beginning. My name is Paul Grayson, and I am 48 years old. I live in North Raleigh, North Carolina, In a house I built in 2017, and by built I mean designed in partnership with an architect, and then managed the construction process with a general contractor, while doing more of the finish work myself on weekends than was strictly efficient, but that produced results I was satisfied with in a way that outsourcing it entirely would not have. I have been this way my entire life. The way is, if something can be understood from the inside, understand it from the inside. This came from my father, Howard Grayson, who was a mechanical engineer at a paper mill in Kannapolis, North Carolina for 33 years. He was the kind of engineer who did not only design on paper. He went to the floor. He understood how the machines behaved in practice versus in theory, and he built that understanding into everything. He designed so the gap between the drawing and the operation was as narrow as possible. He said, "Never let the drawing be smarter than you are. If you cannot explain what the drawing does in physical terms, you do not understand the drawing." I was in software, not paper mill machinery, but the principle was identical. I spent 22 years in IT infrastructure, specifically building and managing the systems that ran other systems. The network architecture, the server environments, the communication infrastructure, the security frameworks that kept enterprises functioning and kept the wrong people from touching what was not theirs. I was good at it because I was my father's son. I understood from the inside. Every system I managed, I built where possible. Where I had inherited a system, I took it apart conceptually until I understood it as if I had built it. The house was an extension of this. The network in the house was an extension of this. The speakers were an extension of this. When I designed the audio system, I spent 3 weekends running cable and setting up the controller and learning the management software until I could do anything I needed to do with the system from anywhere I happened to be on my phone. I did not do this to use it against anyone. I did it because that was how I did things. It just turned out to be useful on a Saturday night in Charlotte at 9:11 p.m. I married Connor's mother, Ellen, in 2019. Ellen was 43 at the time. She had been divorced from Connor's father, a man named Brian, since Connor was 11. The divorce had been the specific kind that was not dramatic and was therefore more complicated in its long-term effects than the dramatic kind, because dramatic divorces produced clear breaks and non-dramatic divorces produced years of managed ambiguity that the children of those divorces absorbed as the emotional landscape of family. Connor had absorbed it. He was a thoughtful kid in some ways and an unclear kid in others. Thoughtful about people, unclear about structure. He had the specific quality of someone who was good at relationships and not good at rules, not because he was rebellious in a principled way, but because the rules in his family life had been soft enough that he had never fully internalized the difference between a rule and a preference. In Brian's house, things were preferences. Dinner was when it was, chores were when they were gotten to, agreements were adjusted when circumstances suggested adjustment. This was not malicious. Brian was a laid-back man and his household reflected him. My house was different. Not rigid, but clear. I had explained this to Ellen before we moved in together and before Connor moved in with us. I said, I want to be clear about what living in this house means, because I think if we are all clear from the beginning, we do not have to have the conversation after something goes wrong. She said, what does living in this house mean? I said, it means the house runs in a specific way and the people in it are part of the system that makes it run. Expenses are shared proportionally. Maintenance is shared. Agreements about use of space and resources are made explicitly, not assumed. She said, you are describing the house like an organization. I said, I am describing it like a system, because it is one. And systems that are not explicitly understood by all the participants tend to fail in ways that are preventable. She said, Connor is 18. I said, that is old enough to understand a system. She said he has not always lived in a system. I said, I know, which is why the conversation now is better than the consequences later. We had the conversation with Connor. Connor was 18, and he listened with the expression of someone who was being respectful while reserving judgment on whether any of this was real or whether it was the kind of thing adults said at the beginning of arrangements and then did not actually enforce. He had not been in a house where the things said at the beginning of arrangements were actually enforced. He was about to be in one. But it took 2 years of graduated lessons and a Saturday night in Charlotte and Beethoven's Fifth at 72% to fully establish that what I said was what I meant. The first 18 months were generally fine. Connor was enrolled at NC State in computer networking, which had been his own choice and which I had supported in the specific way I supported most things that someone I cared about was genuinely interested in. I did not just say that is great, I made myself useful. I sat with him on 2 Sunday afternoons and walked him through the practical side of what the courses were teaching. Not to do his work, to make the theoretical concrete, the way my father had always made things concrete. He was good at it. He had the instinct for it. He also had the instinct for the part of college that was not coursework, which was the social construction of a life that felt expansive and free, and that produced, in certain 20-year-olds, the specific overconfidence of someone who has been competent in a structured environment for the first time, and who has not yet learned that competence in one area did not transfer automatically to judgment in all areas. He was making good grades. He was also making decisions that were increasingly confident in ways that were not always justified by his actual authority. Small things first. He had a friend over 3 nights in a row without mentioning it. Not a problem in itself, but when I mentioned that I had not known and would have appreciated knowing, he said, I did not think I needed to clear it with you. I said, you do not need to ask permission, but this is a shared house and awareness of who is in it is a reasonable expectation. He said, got it. He had the same friend over 3 nights the following week. I mentioned it again. He said, I said, got it. I said, and I am noticing the same pattern. He said, I did not think one guest was a big deal. I said, it is not a big deal. It is a pattern of operating as if the house is solely yours. I am trying to address the pattern before it becomes a bigger pattern. He said, okay, man. The man was new, not hostile, the specific register of a 20-year-old who was managing a conversation with an adult by performing cooperation without actually providing it. I filed this. In the spring of that year, he used my truck without asking. He needed to move something for a friend, and his car was not big enough. He took my keys from the hook by the door and took the truck and was back in 3 hours. He told me afterward, not before. I said, the truck. He said, I brought it back. I thought it would be fine. I said, the issue is not whether it was fine. The issue is that you took something of mine without asking. He said it was just the truck. I was not going to do anything to it. I said, Connor, I want you to hear something. In this house, taking something without asking is not the same as asking and receiving a yes. Even if you are confident the answer would have been yes, the asking is the thing. He said, why does that matter if the answer is yes either way? I said, because your confidence that the answer is yes is based on your assessment of the situation. My yes or no is based on my assessment. They are not the same assessment, and my assessment is the relevant one for my property. He said, that seems rigid. I said, it is clear. Clear and rigid are different things. He said, fine. The fine was the same register as the man. Performance of agreement. I filed this too. The summer party happened the following October. Subscribe to this channel right now and ring the notification bell. The neighbor who texted me was a woman named Diane Acaffer, who lived 2 houses down, and who had the specific combination of neighborhood attentiveness and direct communication that produced the text I received at 8:47 p.m. The text said, "Paul, something is happening at your house. Lots of cars, noise, thought you should know. You in town?" I said, "In Charlotte. Thank you for telling me." She said, "Looks like a party. Pretty loud. Not sure if you knew." I said, "I did not know. I appreciate it." She said, "Do you want me to do anything?" I said, "I will handle it from here. Thank you." I put the phone down. I thought for a moment. Not about what to do, about what Connor had actually done. I opened my phone and searched for the event listing that the neighbor had described in a follow-up text. She had found it shared on a local social media event page. Someone Connor knew had shared it publicly. The listing read, "Saturday night exclusive premium North Raleigh location, fully equipped sound system, and speaker setup, full bar setup, 20 per head, at the door, limited capacity, DM for location drop at 8 p.m. I looked at this for a while. Premium North Raleigh location. Fully equipped sound system and speaker setup. My house, my system, my speakers, my living room. 64 RSVPs at $20. He was running an event in my house as a venue. I opened my laptop. I went to the router management portal. The portal showed me 41 connected devices at that moment. Phones, a streaming device, the DJ controller. I looked at the list. I recognized my own devices immediately. Everything else was a guest. At 9:11 p.m., I went to the network settings. I turned off the guest network first. Every device that was not on the primary network dropped. Then I turned off the primary network for all devices except my own. The house went dark at the network level. I sat for 90 seconds. Then I opened the speaker application. The speaker app had a map of my house with each zone labeled. Living room, kitchen, hallway, primary bedroom, guest room. I selected all zones except the primary bedroom. I set the volume. 72% was a number I had thought about for approximately 30 seconds. Loud enough to be impossible to talk over. Not so loud as to be outside the range of what the speakers were rated for. 72%. I went to my music library. I scrolled to Beethoven. Symphony No. 5 in C minor. The opening 4 notes. Da-da-da-dum. I pressed play. Connor's first text arrived at 9:14. "Dad, the speakers." I replied, "What about them?" He said, "Please stop." I replied, "Stop what?" He said, "You know what." I replied, "Enjoy the party." He said, "Dad, seriously, people are leaving." I did not reply. He said, "The Wi-Fi." I did not reply. He said, "Can you just turn the Wi-Fi on again for like an hour?" I did not reply. He tried to call at 9:17. I let it ring. At 9:20 he sent, "Okay, I understand you are upset." I replied, "I am in Charlotte enjoying a quiet evening. Are you?" He did not reply to that. Ellen texted at 9:22 after Connor reached her. She said, "Paul, what is going on?" I said, "Someone appears to be running an unlicensed event in my house. I am addressing it remotely." She said, "Unlicensed event." I said, $20 entry, 64 RSVPs, full sound system. He was running the house as a venue. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Oh, Connor." She said, "Is the music necessary?" I said, "The system is mine. The music was an appropriate use of it." She said, "Beethoven specifically?" I said, "Beethoven specifically, yes." She said, "Okay." She said, "What happens tomorrow?" I said, "I drive back in the morning and we have a conversation, all 3 of us." She said, okay. She said, Paul. I said, yes. She said, the Beethoven is a little much. I said, it is the right tempo for the situation. She sent a laughing emoji. Then she added, but it is too much. I said, I will consider that for next time. She said, there should not be a next time. I said, no, there should not. I tracked the speaker app for the next 30 minutes. By 9:45, the volume of ambient noise in the house had dropped significantly based on what the speaker system's microphone pickups were registering. People were leaving. The Beethoven continued. At 9:58, Connor texted, everyone is gone. I replied, how was the party? He said, very funny. I said, I am in Charlotte. I will be home by noon tomorrow. Please make sure the house is in the condition I left it. He said, okay. He said, are you mad? I said, I have thoughts. We will discuss them tomorrow. He said, okay. He said, the Wi-Fi. I said, stays off until I get home. He said, my gaming stuff is all online. I said, I know. He said, that's not fair. I said, we will add it to the discussion tomorrow. I put my phone down. I finished the notes I had been working on before the neighbor texted me. I ordered room service. I slept. I arrived home at 11:40 Sunday morning. The house was in acceptable condition. Not perfect. There were cups in places cups should not be. The kitchen had been used as a bar area and had been cleaned but not fully cleaned. The rug in the living room was slightly off-center. 2 of the throw pillows were in the wrong positions. Nothing was broken. Connor had, I would give him this, made a genuine effort to restore order before I arrived. He was in the kitchen when I came in. He said, hey. I said, hey. I put my bag by the door. I looked around. I said, where are the cups in the hallway from? He said, I missed those, sorry. I picked them up and put them in the kitchen. I said, sit down. We sat at the kitchen table. He said, I know. I said, tell me what you know. He said, I should not have done the party without telling you. I said, that is part of what you should know, yes. What else? He said, the entry fee thing. I said, explain the entry fee thing. He said I was going to use it for expenses, the cups and stuff. I said, $20 times 64 is $1,280. How much did cups cost? He said I was going to keep the rest. I said, you were charging people to use my house and keeping the money. He said, I thought of it more like I was hosting an event. I said, you listed my house as a premium venue on a public event page. He said, I know. I said, and charged for admission to a property you do not own. He said, I know. I said, Connor, I want to ask you something. He said, okay. I said, where did you get the idea that this was available to you? He said, what do you mean? I said, I mean, what was your understanding of what was available to you in this house and what was not? He said, I did not think you would mind. I said, you thought I would not mind you charging strangers money to use my living room. He said, I thought you would not want to deal with it, but that if it went fine, it would not be a problem. I said, so you were managing my response to something rather than asking me about the thing. He said, I guess. I said, Connor, that is the pattern I have been describing for 2 years. He said, what pattern? I said, the pattern of operating in this house as if the relevant question is not whether something is okay with me, but whether I will find out about it. He said nothing. I said, the truck, the guests, the extended stays without notice. Each of those was a situation where you were assessing my likely response rather than asking for my actual one. He said, I did not see it that way. I said, I know. That is why I kept describing it, and that is why it kept happening. He said, "What is the difference?" If the answer would have been yes anyway. I said, "I have asked you this before and you said fine. Now I want to actually answer it because I do not think you understood why it matters." He looked at me. I said, "The difference is this. When you take something without asking, you are making two decisions simultaneously. You are deciding the thing is available and you are deciding my position on it. That is two decisions that belong to me. You made both of them without me." He said, "But if you would have said yes." I said, "My yes on the truck 2 years ago would have been yes and I will need it back by 5. My yes last night would have been no. Because last night was not the truck. Last night was you using my property as a commercial venue. Those are not the same category." He said, "I did not know you would say no." I said, "Because you did not ask, you assumed, and the assumption was wrong." He said, "I get it." I said, "Do you?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Connor, tell me what you get." He said, "That I need to ask." I said, "That is the beginning, tell me more." He said, "That the house is yours." I said, "Ours, mine and your mother's." He said, "Okay." He said, "Ours. And being in it is a situation I am in because of your choice and your mother's choice, and not because I have rights to it." I said, "You have rights. A home is not a commercial lease, but the rights are relational, not absolute. They come from the relationship and they operate within the relationship." He said, "What does that mean in practice?" I said, "It means the house is available to you in ways that are appropriate to you being a family member who lives here. Using a room for a friend, using the kitchen, using the truck when you ask and it makes sense. It is not available to you as a commercial asset." He said, "The venue thing." I said, "Yes, that was a specific kind of wrong, not just did not ask. You turned my home into a business without my knowledge and collected revenue from it." He said, "I know." I said, "What happened to the money?" He said, "I have it." I said, "All of it?" He said, "I gave some refunds. People were pretty upset." I said, "How much?" He said, 400 in refunds. I still have 800 and change. I said, "What do you think you should do with it?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Give it to you." I said, "I do not want the money. What do you think you should do with it?" He said, "I do not know." I said, "The people who paid $20 came to a party that ended at 9:45 because the host cut the Wi-Fi and played Beethoven. They paid for an experience and got approximately an hour of it before Beethoven interrupted." He said, "Some of them got refunds." I said, 400 of 1280. What about the rest?" He said, "They left." I said, "They left upset." He said, "Yes." I said, "You have $800 of revenue from an event that did not deliver what it promised. That money was earned through a venue you did not own." He said, "I should give it back." I said, "That is what I would do." He said, "I do not have everyone's information anymore." I said, "You had a Venmo link. You have the history." He said, "That is 60-something people." I said, "Yes." He said, "That is a lot of work." I said, "Connor." He said, "Okay, yes, I will do it." I said, "Every person who paid and did not get a refund." He said, "Okay." He said, "All 800. I said, "All 800. He said, "Okay." I said, "One more thing." He said, "What?" I said, "The listing called this a premium North Raleigh location with a fully equipped sound system." He said, "Yes." I said, "The sound system was mine. The house was mine. The premium was ours." He said, "I know." I said, "I want you to understand that when you market something as a feature, you are making a promise about that feature. The people paid for the sound system and the space. I cut both of those things off at 9:11 p.m. They got 45 minutes of what they paid for." He said, "I know, they were not happy." I said, the Beethoven contributed to the unhappiness. He said, significantly. I said, good. He looked at me. He said, was that the plan? I said, the plan was to demonstrate that the systems in this house belong to the house and to me, and that my absence from the physical location does not mean my absence from what happens in it. He said, you logged in from Charlotte. I said, yes. He said, how long did it take you? I said, about 4 minutes. The router login, the network shutdown, the speaker app, the music selection. He said, 4 minutes. I said, I know the systems. He said, I know you know the systems. I just did not think about it. I said, what did you think about? He said, I thought you were 2 hours away. I said, I was 2 hours away in terms of driving, 12 seconds away in terms of the network. He said, I did not think of it that way. I said, that is why the lesson was available. He said, the Beethoven was a lot. I said, it was 72%. He said, which is very loud. I said, yes. He said, why Beethoven specifically? I said, the fifth is the most recognizable piece of classical music in the Western tradition. If you are going to make a point through music, make a point through music everyone knows. He said, you picked it for that reason. I said, I had about 90 seconds between turning off the network and opening the speaker app. I made a decision. He said, 90 seconds. I said, it was an efficient decision. He looked at the table. He said, I am sorry, Paul. I said, I know. He said, not just for last night, for the pattern. He said it with the specific quality of someone who had genuinely heard something. I said, I know that too. He said, I always thought of the rules here as your preferences. I said, tell me what the difference was. He said, a preference is something you want, but that does not have consequences. A rule has consequences. I said, that is close. What is closer is this. A preference is something I would like. A rule is something the system requires. The house is a system. When you operate outside the system responds. He said, the Wi-Fi and the Beethoven. I said, the Wi-Fi and the Beethoven. He said, the system responded. I said, yes. He said, so it was not really you being angry, it was the house. I said, both. He said, but mostly the house. I said, the house expressing my position, yes. He said, that is a very specific way to think about it. I said, I'm a specific person. He said, I know. He said, Dad. He had been calling me Dad since about 6 months after Ellen and I married. He had started it himself, without announcement. One evening he said Dad instead of Paul, and I did not make a moment of it, and he had used it since. I said, yeah. He said, would you have said yes? I said, to what? He said if I had asked about the party, not the money part, just having people over. I thought about this. I said, I would have said let me think about it and asked you some questions about the size and the timeline and the noise level and what you were planning to do for the neighbors. He said, and then? I said, and then I might have said yes with conditions. Smaller guest list, earlier end time, no entry fee, responsible for any damage, cleanup completed by morning. He said, so probably yes. I said, probably yes with conditions. He said, and I did not ask. I said, you did not ask. He said, so I ended up with Beethoven. I said, yes. He said, instead of probably yes with conditions. I said, yes. He said, that is a very expensive not asking. I said, most not askings are. Subscribe to this channel right now. Ring that bell. Connor spent the following Saturday morning on his phone, working through the Venmo history from the party. He had 61 people who had paid and had not received refunds. He messaged each one individually. He told me this at lunch. He said, I'm about halfway through. I said, "What are you telling them?" He said, "I said the venue turned out to be unavailable, and I am refunding the full entry fee, and I am sorry for the inconvenience." I said, "You said the venue turned out to be unavailable." He said, "It is accurate." I said, "It is." He said, "Some of them are asking what happened." I said, "What are you telling them?" He said, "I said there was a situation with the property owner." I said, "Also accurate." He said, "One guy said he wants compensation beyond the refund for the Uber there and back." I said, "What did you say?" He said, "I said I understood and I was sorry and I could offer the entry fee refund, and that was what I had available." I said, "How did he respond?" He said it was fine. I said he accepted it. He said, "Yes." I said, "What did you learn from that?" He said, "That most people are reasonable when you are straight with them." I said, "Yes." He said, "And when you are not straight with them?" I said, "Then most people are not reasonable because they are not responding to you anymore. They are responding to the version of you that was not straight with them." He said, "That is a lot to think about." I said, "It is straightforward. Honesty is the simplest communication strategy because it requires the least maintenance." He finished the refunds by Sunday evening. He showed me the Venmo history on his phone. 61 refunds, $840 returned. He said, "I had a little extra because I had added a small markup on some of the door fees for people who paid at the door instead of in advance." I said, "So you collected more than you projected?" He said, "Yes." I said, "And the markup people?" He said, "I did not have their Venmo. They paid cash at the door." I said, "How much was the cash?" He said, "About $60. I said, "What are you going to do with it?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I am going to give it to you." I said, "I told you I do not want the money." He said, "You said the money was from using your property as a venue. If I cannot return it to the specific people, it should go to you." I looked at him. I said, "Put it in the jar on the counter." There was a jar on the kitchen counter that Ellen and I used for household cash. Change from purchases, occasional small amounts, the kind of liquid household cash that was useful for the random small things that came up. He put $60 in the jar. He said, "I think that is right." I said, "I think it is right too." He said, "Dad." I said, "Yeah." He said, "I want to ask you something." I said, "Ask." He said, "When you turned off the Wi-Fi and started the music, were you angry?" I said, "Tell me why you are asking." He said, "Because if you were angry, then it was a response to being angry. And if you were not angry, then it was something else." I said, "What would the something else be?" He said, "Deliberate." I said, "I had been in Charlotte for 2 hours when the neighbor texted me. I was working on notes. I sat with the information for about 15 minutes before I logged into the router." He said, 15 minutes. I said, "Yes." He said, "You were not angry." I said, "I was not unaffected, but I was not reacting from anger. I was deciding what response would produce the outcome that needed to be produced." He said, "Which was?" I said, "That you understood the house had systems, and that the systems operated regardless of my physical presence." He said, "You wanted to demonstrate that the house was still the house even when you were in Charlotte." I said, "Yes, exactly that." He said, "That is different from being angry." I said, "It is related to being angry. The anger was real. The response was designed." He said, "How do you do that?" I said, "What?" He said, "Design a response when you are angry instead of just responding from the anger." I thought about this. I said, "I ask myself what the response is actually for." He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "My father told me this when I was 17. What is the argument actually about? If I am going to respond to something, what is the response supposed to produce? Anger produces a response that is about the anger. A designed response produces something that addresses the actual situation. He said, so the Wi-Fi and the Beethoven. I said, we're about demonstrating that the house has systems I control, not about punishing you, not about expressing my feelings about what you did, about making the situation clear. He said they were pretty effective. I said yes. He said the Beethoven specifically. I said the Wi-Fi going off stops the party. The Beethoven ensures that nobody is comfortable staying to wait for the Wi-Fi to come back on. He said it was the right choice. I said for the situation. He said, Dad, when I start networking, when I have my own place and I am setting it up. I said yes. He said, will you help me understand the systems? I said yes. He said the way you did it, from the inside. I said yes. He said, not just how to set them up, but why they work the way they work. I said, that is the only way to understand a system. He said, okay. He said, and if I have people over? I said, you ask. He said, yes. I said, and we discussed the terms. He said, and the answer is probably yes with conditions. I said, usually. He said, usually. I said, not for venues. That requires a different kind of conversation. He said, there will not be venues. I said, no, there will not. He said, okay. Ellen and I talked about the whole situation that Sunday evening when Connor was in his room working on homework. She had not been angry at me for the speaker response. She had been conflicted about it in the specific way of a mother who understood that her son had done something wrong and who also did not fully enjoy watching the consequence be delivered by someone other than herself. I understood this. She said, he is doing the refunds. I said, yes. She said, I did not think he would do all of them. I said, he said he would. She said, he says a lot of things. I said, I know, but he is doing this one. She said, because of last night. I said, I think so. She said, what made last night different from the previous conversations? I said, the conversations described the pattern. Last night demonstrated it. She said, the Wi-Fi and Beethoven demonstrated the pattern. I said, I was not there in person, but the systems were, and when he activated the venue, the systems responded. She said, he used the word systems when he was talking to me this morning. I said, I know, we talked about it. She said, you talked to him for a long time. I said, we had things to discuss. She said, he seemed different afterward. I said, in what way? She said, settled, like something had resolved. I said, it probably had. The uncertainty about what the rules actually were has been there for 2 years. I think last night made it clear. She said, the Beethoven made it clear. I said, the systems made it clear. She said, Paul. I said, yes. She said, is it going to stick? I said, I think so. Not because he was scared, because he understood something. She said, what did he understand? I said, that operating without asking was not a workable strategy in this house. That the house has a kind of permanence he cannot get around by waiting for me to be in Charlotte. She said, you brought the house with you. I said, the systems of the house, yes. She said, via the router. I said, via the router. She said, and Beethoven. I said, and Beethoven. She said, he asked me this morning why Beethoven specifically. I said, he asked me too. She said, what did you tell him? I said, that the fifth is the most recognizable piece in the Western tradition, and if you are making a point through music, you should make a point through music everyone knows. She said, you had 90 seconds to decide. I said, it was an efficient decision. She looked at me. She said, You know what Connor said after you told him that? I said, what? She said, he said that is exactly how you would think about it. I said, he is not wrong. She said, he is not wrong about you. I think that is actually progress. I said, understanding someone is the beginning of working with them. She said, yes. She said, and the Barolo. I looked at her. She said, I am kidding, but he should know about the Barolo. I said, I will tell him about the Barolo when he is older and has better taste. She said, you're going to tell him about the Barolo. I said, when the time is right. She said, you really like that wine. I said, it was an excellent wine. The story of how I lost 60% of it to Sandra is one I will save for an appropriate moment. She said, Sandra and Connor could compare notes. I said, I hope they never meet. She laughed. The specific laugh of someone who was genuinely amused. I said, how do you think the next year goes? She said, with Connor. I said, yes. She said, I think he is going to be better, not perfect, better. I said, I agree. She said, he actually likes you, you know. I said, I know. She said, even before this, he was just testing the edges. I said, yes. She said, and you held the edges. I said, that is the job. She said, it is not always the easy job. I said, no. She said, most people do not hold the edges consistently enough. I said, most people do not design responses. They react to feelings. She said, you design responses. I said, I try to. She said, 90 seconds and you had Beethoven. I said, it was a good 90 seconds. She said, yes, it was. Connor came down for dinner that evening. He helped set the table without being asked. He ate and contributed to the conversation. After dinner, he cleaned up the kitchen more thoroughly than he had cleaned it up in the 2 years he had lived with us. He said good night. He went upstairs. Ellen and I looked at each other across the kitchen. She said Beethoven. I said the right tempo for the situation. She said yes. She said I love you. I said I love you too. We sat in our kitchen in a house that was ours, and that ran the way it ran, and that had systems that operated regardless of where I was physically located. The Wi-Fi was on. The speakers were quiet. The jar on the counter had $60 extra in it. Everything was as it should be. Here is what this story is about. It is not about the Wi-Fi. It is not about the Beethoven, which I have to admit was the most enjoyable part from my perspective, not because I wanted to ruin the party, but because the fifth is genuinely excellent and 72% was a reasonable volume for a point that needed to be made. The story is about what my father told me when I was 17 years old. Never let the drawing be smarter than you are. Know the system from the inside. I built the house. I built the network. I installed the speakers. I set up the router, not because I was planning for a Saturday night in Charlotte, because understanding the things I depend on is how I operate. Connor used my house as a venue because he believed that my being 2 hours away was the same as being out of reach. He was wrong because I was not out of reach. I was 12 seconds from the router management portal. 4 minutes from a complete system response. The knowledge of the system was not a tool I had built to use against him. It was just the way I built things. It just turned out to be useful. Here is the other thing this story is about. The asking. For 2 years, I explained to Connor the difference between taking and asking. He performed understanding and did not actually change behavior because the performance of understanding had been sufficient in his previous experience. The Wi-Fi and Beethoven were the moment the performance was no longer sufficient. Not because I was angrier than I had been, because I was clearer. I designed a response that made the situation unmistakable. The house had systems. The systems operated. His absence from the property owner did not mean his absence from the property. Connor understood this. He did the refunds. All $800. Every person who paid and did not receive a refund. He did not have to do that. No one would have known if he had kept the money. He did it because he understood what the money was. And understanding what the money was came from understanding what he had done. And understanding what he had done came from the Wi-Fi going off and Beethoven starting at 9:13 p.m. My father said, the drawing should never be smarter than you are. The corollary is, the system should never be smarter than its operator. I built the system. I operated it. The system did its job. So did I. Thank you for being here for this one. Like this video right now. If the Beethoven moment produced the response it was designed to produce, hit the button. Subscribe to this channel and ring the notification bell. New stories every week, real ones. Share this with someone who has a Connor in their life. Someone who is performing cooperation while testing edges. Let them see that understanding your own systems is the beginning of everything. Comment below. Tell me what song you would have chosen at 9:13 p.m. Beethoven was right for the situation, but I want to know what you would have picked. Tell me everything.